Well, let's get straight into the analysis of what's been happening. Gulliver Cragg is awaiting us in Kyiv. Gulliver, of course, is our Ukraine correspondent who's been across this story from day one. Gulliver, good evening to you. Here in the studio, Douglas Herbert, our international affairs commentator. Doug, great to see you. And joining us from afar, Philip Ingram, former British intelligence officer. Mr. Ingram, thank you very much for joining us. Let's start with Gulliver in Kyiv. Gulliver, give us a sense of the situation where you are today.
Well, you know, according to some calculations, it was the third massive drone attack or combined drone and missile attack on the Ukrainian capital in 24 hours. So as you can imagine, the Ukrainians are quite tired. There are the sounds of explosions throughout the night as well as the sirens as the Ukrainian air defences are working. And all of this plays on people's nerves, makes them feel quite angry and contributes, I think, to a sense among Ukrainians of some satisfaction at seeing that Russians were getting a little bit of a taste of their own medicine with these attacks on Moscow as well, which Kyiv, of course, denies, but denies without hiding its satisfaction, and I think wouldn't be too upset if people suspected a bit that at the very least they were.
Gulliver Cragg in Kyiv. We'll be rejoining in a moment. Let's bring in Douglas Herbert here next to us. Douglas Herbert, of course, our international affairs commentator. Doug, we heard from Gulliver about the situation in Kyiv, where people clearly, after 3 nights of consecutive attacks from Russia, are feeling tired, perhaps worn down. And clearly the tactic here from Russia is to try to wear down Ukrainians' resistance. Good luck with that, some people might say.
Well, I mean, we've seen on the one side here a wave of 17 attacks this month so far, drone attacks, various types of missile attacks, which have hit largely Kyiv, but not just Kyiv, also other towns, cities throughout Ukraine. So adding to this sense that nowhere is truly off limits. You're not really safe anywhere you are in Ukraine. But yes, most of that drone fire has been really concentrated on Kyiv. And obviously the Russians maintaining the line that they have maintained all along, which is that they do not target civilians. They only are targeting military facilities. And yet you see the evidence and you see the photos, you see the videos of a lot of damage to civilian infrastructure. So whether it's just the fault of these so-called pinpoint precision weapons not hitting the right targets, we don't know. But it's been disproportionate with respect to, it's not a tit-for-tat thing. The Ukrainians are hit by drones, the Russians are hit by drones. These types of drone attacks have been very exceedingly uncommon in Moscow. I mean, these are the first ones that have hit civilian areas, even if the Russians say that they aren't targeting. The Russians say that the Ukrainians were targeting civilians. The fact of the matter is, debris and others are reported to have hit in civilian areas. 3 main areas in the Moscow sort of concentric. It's a giant sprawling city in the Moscow area. Some sightings of drones as well in outside Moscow and the Moscow surrounding region as well. But let's be clear, there have really only been a handful of these attacks, 2 to be precise when it comes to drones. We reported extensively early this month in May when there was that the video of what was said to be a drone attack on the Kremlin, which Russia qualified as an attempt to assassinate Vladimir Putin, something which Ukraine has ambiguously played on but denied that it was anything such. So it's disproportionate. You've had a wave of bombardments of drones on Ukraine, and you've had a handful of very few attacks on Russia, but which has now taken the fight essentially to the heart of Russia and its showcase capital.
It is an interesting development. Douglas, for now, thank you very much indeed. Gulliver Cragg is rejoining us any second. Let's bring in Philip Ingram, former British intelligence officer, for his take on the situation. Philip, thank you for being with us here in France 24. Always appreciate your time. Douglas, just discussing the situation in Moscow. Can I start with you there about what happened in Moscow? Do you get any sense that this could be something that perhaps isn't quite as it seems? Maybe Russia kind of trying to set something up to make it look like what happened?
Yeah, that's one of the options. Vladimir Putin could be using this as an excuse to try and justify him having to compulsory mobilize an awful lot of people because he is losing on the battlefield and is worried about the Ukrainian counteroffensive. But more likely it is one of the Russian dissident groups that is supporting Ukraine rather than fighting with Ukraine in Ukraine itself, or it's Ukraine as part of its wider preparation of the battle space. We're in the deep battle, preparing the battle space for this long-awaited counteroffensive that is going to start. But that starts with dislocating your enemy's expectations, hitting Moscow was focusing politically, and other military assets to have to stay there. We saw the small excursion up towards Belgorod, where part of Russia was invaded by this group of Russians, and we're seeing more and more strikes into the Russian-held elements of Ukraine, attacking their command and control and their logistics sites. It's all softening them up for the ground offensive.
Philip, Vladimir Putin is saying that Ukraine, if indeed it was Ukraine with the drone strikes, is targeting civilians. Some might say that's rich coming from Vladimir Putin. Also saying that Russia didn't start the war.
Well, he's working on his own playbook. I don't understand how, if you invade another sovereign country, which he did in February last year, he couldn't say he didn't start the war, because it's quite clear that he did, and he is actively targeting civilian infrastructure and civilians. He's done this. This is part of the Russian playbook. He did this supporting Bashar al-Assad in Syria. He did this in Georgia. This is what the Russians do, and he's just continuing to do it. Of course, he will throw denials out left, right, and centre. The Russians have got a doctrine called maskirovka, which is all masking, which is trying to throw people off the scent, but it doesn't work. It's working for his own population, but it doesn't work for the rest of the world.
Philip, bear with us, please. We'll get back to you as soon as we can. Just to remind you, we have Douglas Herbert here, our international affairs commentator, Gulliver Cragg, our Ukraine correspondent, hearing us very well now in Kyiv. Gulliver, welcome back into the discussion. We've been hearing about various takes on what might have happened in Moscow. Possibly it's something that the Russians may be saying
yes,
happened but didn't quite happen the way that they're describing it.
There's a point I'd like to make.
Go ahead, Gulliver, go ahead.
There's a point I'd like to make. The point I'd like to make is that Russia is, on the one hand, accusing Ukraine of targeting civilians in Moscow, and on the other hand, claiming to have intercepted and diverted by intercepting their remote control mechanisms all of the drones that were fired at the Russian capital. So there's no evidence whatsoever that they were aiming at civilian targets or residential buildings in any way, because the Russians say they diverted or intercepted them. But the same goes for the Russian drones that attacked Kyiv overnight. The Ukrainians may think that they were attacking civilian targets, but they also say that they intercepted, 29 out of 31 of them. We don't know where the other two that hit their targets actually hit. The fact that there's no information about that would suggest that they were actually aimed at and hit military targets, and that may have been the case for others as well, but they were intercepted, diverted, and so much the better, because although the damage today done by these drones in some areas of Kyiv is quite significant, and sadly one person died and 13 were injured, it's nothing compared to the damage that could have been done had the drones not been intercepted and been able to hit their targets and explode with the full force of their warheads.
Is there a sense, Gulliver, where you are, that this is all part of preparation for the counter-offensive? Some say the counter-offensive is already underway. Others say, of course, there won't be any great fanfare when it's launched. But is there a sense there that what we're seeing here is perhaps Ukraine showing it has more reach, more strength, and getting the Russians worried?
Perhaps, yes. I mean, what I've been a little bit surprised at in the commentary today is that a lot of Ukrainians seem to think that these attacks on Moscow will, whether they hit any targets at all, somehow diminish Russians' support for Vladimir Putin and his war on Ukraine. And no one's really presented any convincing evidence for that. After all, when Kyiv is targeted by Russian attacks, it tends to send Ukrainians in the other direction and make them all the more defiant. Of course, the situation is different. Kyiv's war defending itself against an invasion is perhaps, you might say, inherently justified, whereas Russia's is much less justified. But nevertheless, I think that Ukrainians seem to be indulging in a lot of wishful thinking about the effect that these attacks on Moscow might have on Russian morale. But certainly there's an attempt here to distract the Russians. I think with the attacks on Belgorod region earlier this month, just across Ukraine in Russia, that was a much clearer attempt to distract the Russian military, to make them divert resources perhaps. But mainly what's going on is all of these attacks on Kyiv are, of course, a Russian attempt to exhaust the Ukrainian air defences, keep them defending Kyiv. caused the Ukrainians to have to expend huge amounts of ammunition shooting down these drones and these missiles. So I think that there is clearly a military purpose there for the Russians in trying to hamper the Ukrainians as they try to prepare to start their counteroffensive.
Understood, Gulliver. Loud and clear. Gulliver Cragg there in Kyiv. Douglas, Vladimir Putin's issue, of course, is that once upon a time, back on February the 24th, he said this will all be over in 72 hours.
He was obviously taken off guard there. He did not expect this. I mean, he might deny it. He might maintain to this day that there was a coherent plan all along and that this is all part of that special military operation, which is until now going smoothly, according to the propaganda on the state-run outlets. The fact of the matter is, and this is addressing Gulliver's point before, time and again there's been a lot of, you have to call it wishful thinking, that's the right term, in the West, that somehow support for Vladimir Putin would start to dwindle, would start to taper off. And there's been a lot of narratives to the effect that certainly this is now going to erode Putin's support. And yes, there have been times where it did seem like his support was on the verge of tipping, perhaps, and declining, especially last fall during the mass mobilization, where we saw everyone rushing the exits, a lot of young men to get out of the country before they were drafted. But the fact of the matter is, whenever people have been on the verge of trying to predict, reports of Putin's demise or his popularity declining, he has still maintained popularity. Obviously, divining Russian public opinion is an extremely hazardous affair, very difficult. It's unclear whether people tell pollsters even the truth. And at times like this, Russians do tend to err on the side of more patriotism rather than less. We saw it in the Victory Day parade back on May 9th, where there was an uptick in the support for Vladimir Putin. And once again, this episode here, this drone attack, what the Russian Defense Ministry says, 8 drones, 5 of which they shot down, 3 of which they disabled with electronic warfare. This is a type of thing that, like Gulliver just said, it really can, it's a two-edged sword. And in this case, it could also work, no matter how counterintuitive it may seem, in Vladimir Putin's favor. It could rally the support. It could actually have a boosting effect on Russians' perhaps deeply ingrained sense of patriotism. Doesn't mean everyone loves Vladimir Putin. Doesn't mean they're all four square behind the war. But at a time like this, given the fact that you still have tens of millions, if not over 100 million Russians who really rely almost single-handedly on the state-run propaganda media, getting a very filtered view of this war, this propaganda narrative works a lot better than you might think. It's very toxic. It's industrial-strength propaganda. And that's why the patriotism is still at the levels it is. And that is why Vladimir Putin's support, despite all that wishful thinking in the West, remains relatively high 16 months into this war.
Douglas, thank you. Let's bring back in Philip Ingram, former British intelligence officer. We're hearing from around the table and, of course, from Kyiv, Philip, that in spite of Moscow getting a taste of what the war is about with these attacks, any talk of Vladimir Putin's demise might be exaggerated. There has been signs of some kind of dissidence within the country. There have been anti-war protests, but nonetheless, are you convinced that Putin is still on a very firm footing?
Well, I think he's on a fairly firm footing. I would not necessarily say a very firm footing, but he's well isolated and well protected. The interesting bit is when you see the leader of the Wagner private military company, Prigozhin, openly criticizing what the Russian Ministry of Defense and Russian commanders on the ground are doing inside Ukraine, and calling them out very, very publicly after this drone attack in Moscow. That showing that there is not a unity of command. It doesn't really matter at the top. Putin is a dictator and is controlling it from a dictatorial perspective. But actually, when it comes to unity of command on the ground inside Ukraine itself, this will cause real difficulties between the Russian military commanders, Prigozhin, and the political oversight that's going in, which is what the Ukrainians will want to do. They're putting a proverbial information knife in it. They're wiggling it as much as they can, and they will exploit that whenever they start to launch the next phase of their counteroffensive.
Philip, for now, thank you very much indeed. Gulliver Cragg in Kyiv, can I come back to you? We're going towards the evening now, where you are, where we are, of course, right across Europe. I take it there you're probably braced for more of the same.
Well, yes, I guess so. We'll go to bed wondering whether or not we're going to be woken up by the siren in the middle of the night and then explosions following. It's happened 17 times so far this month. One wonders just how many of these drones and rockets the Russians have. There had been in Ukraine quite a lot of optimism that the attacks that there were quite intensely throughout the winter would not continue into the spring and summer because the Russians would want to save on ammunition. They seem to have gotten a big delivery of these Shahid drones from Iran, though, recently, which I think is one reason why the Ukrainian parliament passed a sanctions package against Iran just this week.
Gulliver Cragg, thank you. Douglas Herbert, the situation then, as Gulliver's saying, there in Kyiv and across Ukraine, people are braced for another night, possibly of no sleep, with the alerts going off.
No sign.
I'm wondering what the situation is in Russia. I mean, clearly, that propaganda machine you're talking about, that we all know about, will have, I imagine, worked its magic on the Russian people. We won't be expecting more kind of attacks as we've seen in Moscow over the past 24 hours.
Yeah, increased attack. The Ukrainians, are probably braced, as you just heard Gulliver say, for more of the same along this line. Look, the Russians have cast this entire drone attack in the state media today. The Russians have basically said that this was a reprisal for what the Russian says was their own successful strike against an unspecified Ukrainian military command center. Didn't say where it was, didn't say exactly when it was, but that this was retribution from the Ukrainians for that. When they say this was the fault of the Ukrainian regime directing these drones at us, it was because we hit their command center. So there's really this, in the Russian thing, a tit for tat, both sides preparing. In recent days, we've seen the Russians moving tactical nuclear weapons, as they're called, to Belarus territory. Remember, the territory from which a good part of that full-scale invasion last February originated, was launched. We've seen them moving S-400, reportedly S-400 aerial defense systems into Belarus. There's no sign that this is tapering down. We keep saying the Russians are bracing for the Ukrainian counteroffensive. They're bracing and also ramping up for perhaps their own more muscular type of offensive in the weeks and months to come. Putin is playing the West for time. He thinks time's on his side. He thinks the West is going not to have the stomach for the fight too much longer, despite all the fine words about solidarity with Ukraine. And I hate to say it, but you leave with that Weasley expression, only time will tell.
Douglas, thank you. Thank you to Douglas. Thank you to Gulliver. Thank you to Philip Ingram, former British intelligence officer, for sharing your time and thoughts with us here at France 24. We, of course, are watching all developments on this story, and we'll bring them to you as we get them.